Go. Right.
Right. Okay, well, so yes, as Father Matthew has just said, I'm Josie Godfrey. I've met some of you before, and I'm a seminarian at St Stephen's House in Oxford in the UK. And yeah, Father Robin Ward, who is doing some talks over the last few weeks, is my principal. So he managed to set up this, my being here. I'm having a great time. I only have 1 week left, which I'm very, very sad about. But one of the things I'm really excited to return to in the UK is bell ringing, specifically change ringing, which is a thing that really mostly exists in the UK. 95% of the towers that have bells that are hung for change ringing are in the UK. And then there's just a few sort of scattered across the rest of the world. In North America, there are 50 towers. You're lucky to have one here in New York at Trinity Church, Wall Street. There's a few in Washington, DC. There's a few in Philly, some in Boston, and others sort of scattered around, usually in the most unlikely places. I mean, the ones in DC are at the National Cathedral, which makes sense. Virginia Theological Seminary makes a bit of sense. The old post office tower makes less sense, but they were put in there as a joint thing with the bells at Westminster Abbey, so they're a sort of replica of those to promote some sort of Anglo-American relations. So bell ringing, it's often called campanology, but bell ringers themselves don't usually like being called campanologists because it's technically the campanology is the study of bell ringing, whereas what we're doing is ringing them. But I'm giving you a talk on bell ringing, and therefore I think you can legitimately call me a campanologist. So, as I said, there's only 50 churches across the whole of North America that have bells hung in this special way. Obviously, most churches have some bells, one bell, more bells, there's lots of bells here. And there's various different ways that you can ring a bell. So you can have it hit by a hammer from the outside. You can have it swung with a clapper sort of swinging in the middle of it. You can have lots of different bells that are all being hit by different hammers and can play tunes. In Europe, you have them that they swing, but you hear the sort of cacophony of bells when they're being swung at random times. And it makes a very loud noise and tells everyone that something's going to happen. But without any control over them, you can't tell people what's going to happen. And so in England, and some other parts of the world, they started to develop a system where bells being rung, certain bells being rung at certain times or in certain ways, told you that something was about to happen. So that a funeral was about to take place or a wedding. So, for example, in the case of a funeral, there was a specific signals that the bells could produce to tell you not just that there was a funeral taking place, but the gender of the person and how old they were, so that you could even work out who it was just from listening to the bells. And in England, bells are everywhere. It's pretty rare to be out of earshot of some bells. And interestingly, it's actually usually in the cities where, although the bells are closer together, bells can travel, the sound travels really long distances, miles across sort of open countryside, but can't travel through concrete skyscrapers. And so I'm going to start by giving you an overview of the history of bells, a sort of very brief overview, skipping quickly across many centuries up to the sort of the relatively modern era of English change ringing. So there's some doubt surrounding when the time when the first bell was used, but they were certainly among the first instruments. Obviously, sort of piece of metal that you can hit makes noise. And they were used by the Israelites in the book of Exodus. Moses describes the bells of gold, which adorned the dress of the high priests. The early church was, of course, unable to use bells to summon people to worship, since they could only meet in secret. And so the exact time from which these large bells used to be hung in churches is unclear, but they were certainly common by the 7th century. Many of the early bell foundries were set up in monasteries. It's quite a big operation to make a large bell and sort of heat up all the metal. And yes, so they were set up in monasteries or even inside churches. And there was lots of ceremony involved with the casting of the bells. So there was a blessing of the furnace in which the metal was melted. Bishops themselves were often master bell founders, and priests and abbots would also be present for the casting of the bell. And there was all this ceremony around creating the bell and putting it in the church. And eventually people started to think, how can we do, we were already using bells in different ways to signify different things. How can we make them even easier to control so that we can ring them in even more different ways? And so from the 14th century onwards, bells were hung on a spindle and chimed by pulling a rope, and they'd just swing like this. This developed into a half wheel and then a 3/4 wheel. So that's letting the bell swing half wheel. So the bell's hung on the wheel, and so the bell can swing round, and then a 3/4 wheel, it can spin further round, until by the 17th century, bells were hung on a full wheel, which meant that they could swing 360 degrees all the way round, with a piece of wood called a stay stopping them from going over the top. So the bell starts in this upside down position. When the ringer pulls the rope, it swings all the way around back up to the top. And you could hold it there indefinitely. The stay stops it from going over the top. So you could let go of the rope there and the bell stays up in that upside down position. And this is known as full circle ringing because the bell swings in a full circle, pauses each time its mouth is upwards, and then swings back around in the opposite direction. And there are various advantages of hanging bells in this way. So the further the bell can swing, the easier it is for the ringer to adjust the speed that it's swinging at. Because bells are big, right? We're not talking about these bells. The smallest of the change ringing bells might be sort of this kind of size, and they can get up to much bigger than me. And so once it started swinging, you can't do a lot with it. You can't make it swing a lot faster or a lot slower. You can't hold a bell up when a massive lump of metal is sort of swinging down. And so when it can swing all the way around, then you can adjust the speed at which, not the speed of the swing itself, but when it swings. So it gets to that point, and then you can wait, and when you're ready, you can pull it again. Also, the other benefit of hanging them in this way is that the clapper strikes the bell 3/4 of the way through its swing. So the bell starts like that, it swings round, and when it gets to about this point, that's when the clapper hits the bell, which means that the sound goes out, as opposed to a bell like that that's being hit or swung or whatever, where the sound goes straight down into the church. And that's very important because if the point of the bells is to call people to worship, if you're already in the church, you don't really need to know that someone can probably tell you that the service is about to start. However, hanging them in this way does bring a restriction on what we can do with the bells, because it's not possible to make a bell ring twice in quick succession, because it takes a second or longer, it depends on the size of the bell, and it has to swing all the way around. So we can't make it go ding ding, it's just sort of ding, ding. And that means you can't ring melodies. If you were trying to ring, I don't know, jingle bells, it would be very, very slow. You'd have ding, ding, ding. People would get bored. So because of this, bell ringers created a system in which every bell has to ring once before any of them can ring again. So you start with all of the bells ringing in the right order. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Da, 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 da. That was 8. And so they all have to ring, and then they all have to ring again. And you can never have one bell ringing again before all of the others have rung. And we then wrote patterns in accordance with this system, which are called methods. So each order that all of the bells can be rung is a row. And when the order of the bells changes, it's called a change, hence change ringing. And also that's where the phrase ringing the changes comes from. So each time all the bells ring, they can speed up or slow down a little bit and change the order slightly. It can't completely change the order. If you've just had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you can't suddenly have 7, 3, 6, 8, 5, 4, 2, 1. They can only move by one position, so they can switch places. So after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you might have 2, 1, 4, 3, 6, 5, 8, 7, for example. Or you might have some of them stay the same. So it might be the 3 stays in third place, and you have 2, 1, 3, 5, 4, 6, 7, 8. And there's, so then you use, we create patterns of these changes. So about which pairs of bells are swapping each row. And the idea is you have to compose something where you start in what we call rounds, that's all the bells in the right order, and you end in rounds. And you don't repeat any row in the middle of it. So once you've used 2, 1, 4, 3, 6, 5, 8, 7, you can't ring that again in the whole of the method. And you might be ringing for 5 minutes, or you could be ringing for 3 hours or even longer. So the pinnacle of achievement for bell ringers is to ring a peal. An peal is ringing over 5,000 changes. And it's the reason for that number is that it's all of the possible changes on 7 bells. So it's 7 factorial, if we have any mathematicians, is 5,040. And that's all the possible orders that you can put the 7 numbers, 7 bells in. And that takes about 3 hours to 4 hours, depending on the size of the bells, because like I said, you can't really change the speed that they're swinging at. You can only change it a little bit. So you can't ring them really fast or really slow. And so you ring that non-stop. There's no toilet breaks, there's no drinks breaks, you can't stop to have a chat. You can't swap places with someone. Everyone starts ringing, and 3 to 4 hours later, you get back into rounds, all the bells in the right order again, and everyone is very, very happy with themselves. And you can ring even more than that. If you ring significantly longer than a peal, it's known as a long length. And the longest continuous piece of change ringing took place in Loughborough in 1963, where the full extent of changes on 8 bells was rung, which took 18 hours of non-stop ringing. I can't actually remember the number, but someone can probably work it out. I guess it's 5,040 times 8, I suppose, whatever that is. It's a lot, is the point. And as well as being mentally challenging, bells are quite physically challenging. You're not pulling the whole weight of the bell because it's swinging from this position, so you've got momentum of the bell coming with you. But the lightest bells weigh 50 kilograms, and bells weighing over 2,000 kilograms are not at all uncommon. And they can be quite dangerous if they're rung by someone who hasn't been properly trained, because you've got a massive lump of metal at the end of a rope. And it's entirely safe if you know what you're doing, like lots of things, I suppose. But it usually takes at least a few months of a ringer attending a regular practice to learn how to actually just handle the bell. That's before you get to any of the ringing methods and learning how to change the speed of the bell and anything like that, just to physically be able to ring a bell without resistance. And then, as I said, there's an almost infinite number of methods to learn. I say almost infinite because kind of by definition it's finite because it's restricted by the number of bells. But if you're ringing on, say, 12 bells, there are 479,1,600 different orders in which you can ring them. Now, that's not that number of different methods. That's just each row. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 is one row. There are 479 million of those. And then you can put all of those into different orders, each of those different rows. And that is a big number that I have not worked out. But we don't have to remember 479 million different rows. For one thing, we only need to know what we're doing with our bell. We don't care about anyone else. We just need to know where our bell is supposed to be in the sequence. And the other thing is we don't learn everything separately. There are all sorts of ways of condensing what we're doing. So you might know that your bell is going to be the first one to ring, then the second one to ring, then the third one to ring, then the fourth one to ring. It just continues in that sequence. And that's really easy to remember. You don't even need to remember the numbers. You're just moving through a pattern. And the patterns gradually get more and more complicated, but you build it up gradually. And so this is what the ringers are doing up the tower. Most towers in the UK, as I said, Trinity, Wall Street, it's not what is happening in your tower here. But there is another question, and that's what should the ringers be doing? So should bells be used solely for religious purposes? And what does the sacramental nature of the bells mean for how we should ring them, who should ring them, and when we should ring them? So the ceremony for newly cast bells has been referred to with many different names, including baptism, blessing, consecration, dedication, hallowing, all sorts of things. And the phrase, the baptism of bells, seems to have come into common use in England, at least in the Middle Ages, although baptism-like ceremonies took place as early as the 6th century. And the origin of this practice of sort of ascribing human and or divine attributes to bells seems to come from the likening of bell founding to birth, and this idea that the first ringing of a bell is like the first sound of a voice that's never been heard before. In the Middle Ages, the service of baptism was intended to give bells the power to drive away bad weather and evil spirits, because a commonly held belief at the time was that the air was filled with some sort of evil spirits that could be driven away by certain sounds. So unsurprisingly, the association of bells with the supernatural has, at various points in history, caused the idea of blessing them to be questioned or even forbidden. And many accounts say that Charlemagne attempted to forbid the baptism of bells in 789, although some scholars have argued that the wording of the injunctions shows that the baptism was only forbidden for small bells and was actually still required for large church bells. There are various accounts of the rite of the baptism of bells, but they're usually more sort of anecdotal from a diary or something, rather than being an official record of the ceremony. But they usually share a few important features, and the ceremony is clearly designed to imitate a baptism in some way. So using the bells given a name, sponsors like godparents, blessing the bell with water, making the sign of the cross with oil. I haven't found any example of a peal of bells dedicated by anyone other than a bishop, although it might have happened. There doesn't seem to be a rule that it has to be a bishop, but it could be a thing of, well, we're doing this big service, let's get a bishop in to make it more fun. But all of these things, the bells are decorated. In earlier iterations of the ceremony, it would be with a white robe. Now it's usually ribbons and garlands of flowers. And all of these things together make it seem like a very elaborate ceremony and as if something very, very important is happening. And that's what's led people to have this idea of the baptism of bells, and to and so that even parishes with very low ideas of sacramentality and liturgy still have this big important ceremony when they get new bells. And so based on all these sort of elaborate ceremonies, I'd say it's clear that the bells are obviously certainly blessed. And so once they are blessed, they become sacred objects and are able to fulfill the sacred function of ringing out to the glory of God and to call people to prayer and to worship. And then we question who should ring them, and should they just be rung for worship, for sort of church-related things, or can we ring them for someone's birthday or any sort of secular anything? If the bells, having been blessed, become sacred objects, it follows that whatever you're ringing them for, they are ringing out to the glory of God. So in terms of their sacramental nature, I think it doesn't really matter who is ringing them. The unworthiness of the ringers is not particularly important, because it's the bell itself that's blessed. And so any ringing of the bell is making the sound that the bell is intended to make. So maybe Hammerstein was right when he wrote, "A bell is not a bell till you ring it." Most people, ringers, non-ringers, churchgoers, non-churchgoers, would say that the main purpose of bells is to call people to worship. Bells are only mentioned once in the prayer book, which instructs that the minister shall call a bell to be tolled thereunto a convenient time before he begin, that the people may come to hear God's word and to pray with him. And this sort of simple instruction is clearly the basic purpose of all ringing, but doesn't mean that all other ringing should be disallowed. In fact, the only clear ban on ringing is that of ringing on superstitious occasions, which is forbidden by canon law. And despite the changes in the relationship between the church and the people who might be hearing the bells outside the church, there's a lot to suggest that bells are still an integral part of this union, perhaps even more so now, because they're often the only connection with the church that people have. You can't help hearing the bells, whether you want to or not. So, moving on to the present day, many of you will have watched the Queen's funeral and the events surrounding it over the last few weeks, and you may have noticed that the bells sounded different to usual. So this is because they were muffled, which means putting it's a specially made piece of leather on the side of a clapper, so that when it hits the bell, it makes a duller sound than usual. So instead of dong, it's sort of dong. And we usually ring bells half muffled for any kind of somber occasions, so usually funerals, remembrance of wars, things like that. And that's half muffled. So you get on one side of the bell, it makes this bright dong sound, and the other side makes this dull sound. And there are precisely 2 occasions when you're allowed to ring a bell fully muffled. So it's sort of muffled on both sides of the clapper. And they are the death of the incumbent of the church, which doesn't happen very often, and the death of the monarch, or in this case, it would be the death of the president. Also doesn't happen very often. And so when the Queen died, there was suddenly a lot of confusion because no one had a full set of muffles, because the Queen doesn't die very often. And so everyone panicked. And in the UK, there is basically one main company that makes muffles, and it's a guy called Big Wilf. there's a great article about him on the BBC at the moment. But he and his company basically spent 6 solid days making muffles because everyone suddenly needed them and needed them very, very urgently. And now, of course, they're completely redundant for the next, hopefully, many years. So there's been all sorts of muffled ringing all across the UK. There has been half muffled ringing where people didn't manage to get in touch with Big Wilf and get their muffles. There's also been open ringing, so that's the normal sort of ringing for the proclamation of the new king. So ringers have been in a complete mad time of taking muffles off, putting muffles on, doing all sorts of ringing, which culminated in the funeral. And so they were ringing at Westminster Abbey for the funeral. Despite the BBC coverage claiming that it was Big Ben ringing before the service, it was not. It was someone that I know at Westminster Abbey pulling on the bell, as opposed to someone pressing a button on Big Ben. It's very difficult to toll a bell because you have to do it so slowly. It's because if you're sort of ringing it too quickly, it doesn't sound sad. And so you have to sort of control the bell perfectly to get it to ring at exactly the right time and not keep ringing itself. And so, but yeah, so it can be very difficult, and I don't think they appreciated the news coverage saying that they were in fact someone pressing a button. So church is an important sort of part of life in church life in the UK. So why haven't they really traveled around the world? So they're quite big, they're quite difficult to move, and also, as you've heard, it's learning to ring is difficult and takes a long time. And so there's no point just putting a ring of bells in a church that doesn't have any existing bell ringers there, because no one's going to be able to teach anyone to ring. So they recently put some bells into St Andrew's Cathedral in Singapore, and a group of ringers from the UK had to go out there for 2 weeks to do an intensive teaching course to try and get the locals up to speed. And actually, because it's a very difficult skill to learn, they, at the end of the 2 weeks, they weren't good enough, they weren't safe enough to ring on their own. So then the bells were silent for a while until another group could go back and teach them. And so that's why it hasn't really spread, but it is spreading, and there are there's a North American Guild of Chain Ringers that's quite active. It's a nice community of people. People travel overseas as well. They come on tours to the UK. We come over and ring with them. And as I said, yes, you've got bells in New York at Trinity Wall Street, where they'll, in fact, I think, be ringing right now. So if this talk has inspired you to have a go yourselves, then get in touch with the ringers at Trinity, and I'm sure they'd be delighted to hear from you. So for now, can I take any questions? Hello.
Josie?
Oh, hello. Yes, sorry.
Go ahead. I'll wait.
Are you sure?
Mm-hmm.
How do people practice? If you don't want the bell ringing, spend it on time in the church.
Sure. So
could you repeat the question for the people at home?
Yes. The question was, how do people practice if you don't want the obviously bells are quite loud. You can't practice in the middle of the night because you'll disturb the neighbours. There's not a lot you can do about it. And we do get complaints, usually from someone who's moved into a house next to the church and then complains that the bells that have been there for 300 years are disturbing their Sunday afternoon barbecue. There are ways of silencing the bells. You can set them up with a simulator. You have to put a piece of wood in to stop the clapper from moving and hitting the bell, and then you put sensors in so that when they swing, it triggers, and you have a computer downstairs so that the sound comes out of that. So some churches have one of those, not all. It's a bit of, it's it's a bit of a nuisance to have to do it. And so usually there's a weekly practice, and then there's service ringing Sundays. And yeah, that's all the practicing you get.
Can I show them, Josie, a image, I mean, a little video of the change ringing in my home church?
Yeah, sure.
All right, let me, they installed this at, in 2000,
Which church is
in
it?
Augusta, Georgia.
Okay.
And can you all see and hear this?
Yes. We can see it.
I don't know if you can hear it, but it's essentially how the setup is. You can just see it in action if you can't hear it. And you can see, you know, it's an amazing how a fuzzy part of the rope bounces up and down with the bells. It's something cool. So anyway, I just wanted to show you that.
Yeah, no, thank you.
It looks like we have Michael Galligan. Could you you've risen your hand? Michael?
Okay, here I am. Maybe you mentioned it before at the beginning, but what is our system at St. Thomas?
It's a carillon. I don't know a lot about it. I know that it can play tunes rather than this method, the methods that we ring on full circle bells. Yes, to be honest, I can't really tell you anything useful about it. Sorry.
It's okay.
Does the clapper stay stationary and the bell moves to hit it, or the other, or both, or?
So yeah, the question was, does the clapper stay stationary and the bell move to hit it? So the, I mean, Father Moretz might be able to find a quick video.
I have an image.
Sure, if you want to put an image up, if you've got one. It moves is the simple answer. So the clapper's sort of loose, but only loose in one plane, so it can't sort of flop around anywhere. And so when the bell's up like that, the clapper's there. When the bell swings round, the clapper starts by being pressed up against this top side of the bell, and then gets flicked round and swings across and hits it. Does that make some sense?
You always see sometimes in the movies the big bell, bells around moving this way.
Yeah. Yeah. So if they're not swinging 360 degrees, then it's a bit different. But the clapper does move. In our case, it moves quite a lot because the bell's swinging all the way around. If the bells just swing like that, it doesn't move so much. This is good. Yes. Wonderful. Yes. So that's got a muffle on it. And in fact, that looks interesting, like a muffle that's been sort of made quite quickly at the last minute. Yeah, so the clapper is over on that side of the bell, and then the bell will swing round, so it'll go over that way, and the clapper will, if you can imagine sort of it's staying on that side as the bell moves, and then eventually the weight makes it drop down and hit the other side, and the bell swings back up. And then when the bell comes up, when it's spun 360 degrees and come back up to that position, the clapper will be over on the other side of it. Because it's sort of flipped over.
We have Catherine. Do you want to ask a question? You have to unmute, Catherine.
All right, thank you. I wanted to ask because bells, the tone of bells is different depending on what they're made of and their size. Now, how is that determined, or was it determined at all? Did it just happen? Because this has been going on, as you say, since 600, whatever. There was no recipe. So can you speak to that?
So as far as I know, they're usually made of bronze or brass, and they they can be made of sort of different alloys. I don't know a lot about it. The sort of the purer the metal that they're made of is, the better they'll sound. And the pitch is determined by not the weight of the bell, but it's sort of the size and the thickness of the bell. So occasionally you can have, in church towers, we'll usually have a sort of thing saying how the weights for all the bells. And sometimes it'll be sort of, bell 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but the weights will be the wrong way round, because they cast the bells and then they shave bits of metal off them to make them exactly the right pitch. And sometimes when you're doing that, you just end up needing to shave a bit more metal off because it's a different thickness and different size and all of that. Sorry, something.
Anne Satterfield and then Ginger.
Hello and good morning, Josie. I'm a parishioner here at St. Thomas Church, and I'm also completing my thesis at General Theological Seminary. I want to extend a formal invitation. I haven't spoken to Father Schultz about this yet, but I had planned to.
Is this a question? I'm sorry, Anne.
It's
if
an
you want to have a formal
invitation.
invitation, we have to talk about it later. Is this a question about the class?
It's an invitation to Josie, and I'm about done. I would like to offer you a tour of General Seminary's bell tower. That's it.
Okay.
That's very kind, thank you. Father Schultz has just left the room, unfortunately, but I will, if we could get in touch about that later, that would be brilliant. Thank you. Hello. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. You go first. Yeah.
If the bells are different sizes, presumably the swing, the 3/4 swing, would be a different amount of time for each one to happen.
Yes. Yes.
How does one play a tune?
Well, so you can't play a tune anyway, but when you're ringing methods, as you say, the bigger bells are on bigger wheels and it takes longer for them to swing round. So you have to ring at the speed of the biggest bell, really. They can't do a lot to change their speed. But the people on the lighter bells have more control over changing the speed. So they have to, it's particularly noticeable if you're ringing on a large number of bells, say 12 bells, because the biggest one is a lot bigger than the smallest one. So the person on the smallest bell pulls their bell and it goes up and they have to just sort of wait. And like I said, it can stay on that top point indefinitely in theory. And so they have to have more control over what the bell's doing so that they have that ability to wait for all the other bells to ring and then they can pull theirs again.
Which is far more normally hear something that sounds random like a beat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Ginger is online wanting to ask something.
Two things. One is just to say that what we have at St. Thomas is a carillon. And carillons are played by a keyboard and a foot pedal board too. And they're not rung by ropes. And it's a beautiful thing we have. The other thing is I became interested in change ringing when I read Dorothy Sayers' 9 Tailors. Could you talk a little bit about all the terminologies that she used in the book? Because of my lack of familiarity, I couldn't really appreciate the book fully. So I was really hoping you would talk about that. So when I reread the book, I'll get it.
Sure. Now, I haven't actually read the book. It's been on my list for a while. I'm aware of it, and I'm aware that it's got lots of terminology in it. Not knowing exactly what the words are, there's a lot of very strange terminology in change ringing. If you've got any specific words, I could tell you what they mean. If not, maybe we could talk offline later, and you're very welcome to email me or anything with questions about it.
Okay, so the question really is, does each sequence have a special name?
Not usually. There's a few sequences that do. Rounds is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Yeah.
You've got Queens is ringing all the odd numbered bells, then all the even numbered bells, which sounds a bit like a sort of arpeggio. So 1, 3, 5, 7, 2, 4, 6, 8. There are a few like that, and it's usually the more musical sounding changes, the ones that sound nice, that have names like that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Don't worry about digitizing.
Did you yourself learn this skill and practice?
Yes.
I recall when I was studying at Oxford, every Saturday morning at 11 o'clock, suddenly there was a whole cascade of bells ringing, and I heard it was practice.
Sure.
What was your practice?
There's a lot of ringing in Oxford. It's one of the things I love most about being there. And it's the same group of ringers that ring everywhere, which is nice. Yes, I think your Saturday morning practice must have disappeared because I'm not aware of any Saturday morning thing now. But yeah, there's practices at all of the different churches and colleges on different nights of the week. There's lots of ringing on Sundays in all sorts of different places, and we ring for other special events in the colleges. We're often asked to ring for, any special event they might be having. Yes.
I was in a parish that bought bells from Whitechapel. And what it did for the parish was quite extraordinary, not only for the bell ringers, but naming the bells. So the Sunday school named the bell, and you just didn't name the bell, you had to find out other names of bells and why they were named that way, and it became a whole educational piece. And the people went down to another church to learn how to do bells and the change ringing. So it brought a variety of churches together as well. And I could go on, but there is a significant effect on the local parish. If they use this as a tool for teaching, evangelism, stewardship, we used it for just about everything. And it was very exciting for the whole community. And of course, we get people who complain.
Yes. Oh, that's brilliant. That's really good to hear.
It's time to start winding down.
Great. Are we all done with questions? I think. Oh, yeah. So, yes.
When you said that the bells would be muffled for the monarch or the incumbent of the church, who is that, like Bishop of Canterbury?
Oh, sorry. The rector or the priest. It would usually be the vicar for us, but so here the equivalent of what would happen here would be if Father Turner were to pass away, then the bells would be rung fully muffled, except they wouldn't because it's the wrong sort of bell. Yes. Great. Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
It sounds like some of you already have bell-related connections, but if you are interested in having a go, get in touch with the guys at Trinity Wall Street. They'd be very happy to teach you how to ring, or show you the bells, or show you the tower, or let you come along to one of their practices to see what it's all about.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
You're only here for what? Oh.
Unfortunately, yes. Thank you, Bob.
You're gonna come back?
I'd like to. I have to be invited, I think.
Do you need a